This is a podcast from Duncan Cartlidge Online, the online resource for all construction professionals that's available 24/7. Now, please don't forget to subscribe at the place you usually get your podcasts, so as not to miss a thing in this second series, as well as visiting our YouTube channel. Excuse my huskier than normal voice today. I'm just getting over a severe bout of man flu. Hello again and welcome to another podcast from Duncan Cartlidge Online. As usual, Barney, my red Labrador, is here to offer advice and to keep an eye on proceedings. And by the way, we would really appreciate it if you would like to write a review. In this last episode for 2024, we will have a look at the year ahead, what's in it for construction, and festive hospitality, some recollections of Christmas past. So let's kick off with a look in the crystal ball. The year ahead, what's in it for construction? Promises. So after months of promises and target setting by the new Labour government, not to mention milestones, missions, pillars and, don't forget the foundations, we finally got a look at the detail, but do the figures add up? On the face of it, it looks like good news, with £100 billion being borrowed to fund major infrastructure projects over the next 2 years. I suppose the question is, in the words of the song, what are we going to do when the money runs out? The rumours during the past months that billions of pounds of new borrowing are to be spent by the government on 150 new infrastructure projects because of new self-imposed Treasury rules proved to be true. The Treasury confirmed it will loosen the long-standing self-imposed target on cutting debt to borrow billions more to invest on a range of major projects. It is hoped that the introduction of experts to vet unfunded spending will avoid the kind of market meltdown seen during the Liz Truss era. Apparently, the experts will be known as guardrails. I wonder who thought of that one. The initiative is part of a plan to encourage the private sector to invest in British projects. The guardrails, it is claimed, will determine the quality of government borrowing for investment in order to ensure that money is not committed for projects that are not viable, and to convince the private sector to invest. But does this all sound vaguely familiar to the smoke and mirrors accounting that surrounded the PFI in the late 1990s? The much criticised and now debunked PFI was the cornerstone of the last Labour government's infrastructure plans, aided and abetted by Chancellor Gordon Brown. And by the way, get your application in now to be a guardrail. In its attempts to build 1.5 million houses during the next 5 years, the government's plan to recategorise poor quality green belt as grey belt is likely to result in confusion among planners and a surge in legal challenges. NIMBYs and environmentalists will be swept aside, and if you're a bat, you've no chance, you're toast. In order to triple the number of approvals for major infrastructure schemes compared to the last Conservative Parliament, the government announced it will streamline the approval process in the forthcoming Planning and Infrastructure Bill. In a recent policy relaunch, Starmer described the current planning system as a, and I quote, blockage in our economy that is so big it obscures an entire future, adding that it was preventing the construction of projects including roads, grid connections, laboratories, rail lines, power stations and wind farms. Of course, the elephant in the room by people setting targets is that construction is being asked to produce more houses, prisons, hospitals, schools, but without proposals on how we are supposed to find the hundreds of thousands of new workers required by the end of the decade. Labour's grey belt concept, which has been out for consultation as part of the proposed changes to the National Planning Policy Framework, is meant to make it easier for protected land to be released for development if it doesn't perform. For example, disused petrol stations fall into the definition of grey belt land. The government has also set golden rules that grey belt development must include a 50% affordable housing requirement. The Town and Country Planning Association described the proposed grey belt definition as unclear and extremely broad. In addition, there is little research or evidence to establish what grey belt means, and how the notion of making land limited contribution to the green belt could be interpreted. There is also concern that the policy will be highly controversial, and this political battle will be a diversion from the real issue of dealing with the housing crisis. To make matters worse, many people in the know would not go near a new build house due to their terrible reputation of poor workmanship and the endless problems in trying to get snagging work carried out on what has been called a new build nightmare. Some commentators predict that house building will not significantly increase until 2027. While on the topic of contractor competency, the authors of the Grenfell report identified a raft of errors that led to the disaster, which they have attributed in the most part to incompetence, carelessness, as well as serious deficiencies in construction skill, knowledge and experience. In a previous podcast, I drew attention to the idea that we all assume the contractors and subcontractors know what they're doing and are competent and conscientious. Ask anybody who has recently bought a new build house if they think that's the case. As of October 2023, anyone carrying out the new duty holder roles of principal contractor on construction projects must demonstrate their competence. This requirement, introduced in last year's amendments to the building regulations, will take on sharper focus when building control becomes formally regulated. For a contractor wishing to prove their competence, the CIOB has introduced a Principal Contractor Competency Certificate Scheme based on PAS 8672. It is a competence-based validation of a person's skill to carry out the new duty holder roles of a principal contractor under the building safety legislation. However, it does not relate to the historic role under the CDM regulations. Candidates complete a written competence-based application form and then attend a peer review, and this must be renewed every 5 years. Candidates need to be a member of the CIOB or other professional body that holds them to a code of ethics and have 3 years appropriate experience. The scheme has two categories. One covers all buildings, excluding high-rise buildings, and the other is for all buildings. Now, to be realistic, sending 1 or 2 contract managers on the certification course is not going to solve the problem, as no one individual can be expected to possess the full range of competencies given the breadth and the complexity of building works. However, principal contractors are expected to have sufficient technical expertise for ensuring building safety, compliance with the building regulations, and the quality of work by others under their responsibility. In a recent article in Building Magazine, Tony Bingham suggested that builders are just, and I quote, put-uppers, and certainly should go nowhere near designing parts or even a whole building. This should be left to the professions. But doesn't this just reinforce the them and us culture that hasn't really done a good job for us so far? Remember the theme of the Latham report: trust in the team. The problem is that although contractors badge themselves as competent to carry out design and build projects, we only play at it in the UK. Having worked in France for a while, I witnessed how design and build should work in a system where many of the firms have their own in-house bureau d'études, literal translation, research office, comprising engineers, architects, and the equivalent of a QS, etc. They translate the concept designs to working drawings. Unlike the UK, where very often the design part of the process is a temporary alliance with consultants on the basis of no win, no fee. The French system also mandates latent defects insurance, policed by a bureau de control, who ensure that the project meets the standards and the specification. This comes at a cost, of course, a few percentage points on cost, but it could be worth it. And now, moving on to our second topic, a look at festive hospitality. The level at which hospitality changes from being a token gesture to being a request for a favour, wink wink, nod nod, say no more, has always been a grey area for construction. During my career, I have worked for a number of organisations and enjoyed their festive hospitality, some of which I share with you now. Back in the 1970s, I worked for one of the UK's largest QS private practices in central London, and one of the perks of my job was LVs, or luncheon vouchers, for, believe it or not, 15 pence a day. But they were tax-free. Yippee! Luncheon vouchers finally disappeared in 2018, but for those who don't know what they were, these were paper vouchers that you could set against the cost of your lunch or other food. On the last day before the office shut for Christmas, and in some years, that was Christmas Eve, the practice held a drinks party in the working up department for the staff, for which you were asked to contribute, yes, you've guessed it, a 15p lunch voucher. I recall the London Underground being full of rather inebriated office workers making their way home on the day most offices closed in London, although of course we had to be back on the 27th unless you booked holiday. I worked in another practice where the senior partner called all the staff into his office just prior to Christmas on an individual basis and handed them some turkey money, for which you had to show grovelling appreciation. In the summer, prior to your 2-week summer holidays, the same process, but with, yes, you've guessed it, ice cream money. The first practice I ever worked for after leaving college, again in the 1970s, gave everyone, irrespective of whether they needed one or not, a very large, fresh, free-range turkey. As I was single at the time, and I didn't have a fridge, I handed mine over to the Salvation Army several days after I'd received it, just as it started to walk towards the door. And finally, the 1970s were dominated by the Paulson T. Dan Smith scandal. Paulson, an architect, although I don't believe he was actually qualified, started to bribe every local authority official he could find to win work during a massive countrywide house building programme. Sounds familiar? Paulson met T. Dan Smith, leader of Newcastle City Council, who liked to be known as Mr. Newcastle, and the two embarked on a path of bribery on an agricultural scale to build what turned out to be poor quality system-built social housing that has since been demolished. Both Paulson and Smith were found out, and both were jailed in 1974 at Leeds Crown Court, although Paulson continued to insist he'd done nothing wrong, despite having handed out, in today's value, almost £8 million in bribes. T. Dan Smith later commented that his conditions in prison were better than some of the housing that he'd built during this period. After their conviction, I remember local authority staff refusing to accept simple items such as calendars or pens from suppliers. Even so, just as the pair were starting their jail sentence, I recall a contractor taking me for a very long lunch in the revolving restaurant at the top of the Post Office Tower in London, operated by Billy Butlin. Yes, Billy Butlin of the holiday cap fame, before loading me with bottles of whiskey and cognac and sending me on my way. Happy days. Well, that's all for this episode. I hope you found it interesting. This has been a podcast from Duncan Cartlidge Online. Thank you for listening, and from Barney and I, or is it me? I can never remember. Anyway, we would really appreciate it if you were to subscribe, and if you have time, write a review. Finally, from Barney and me, we would like to take this opportunity of thanking you for your support during 2024 and wishing you a very happy festive season and a very prosperous 2025. See you next year.